father of Western philosophy, asked his student, Glaucon, if astronomy should be among the subjects to be studied. Glaucon said in reply, I think so. To know something about the seasons, the months, and the years is of use for military purposes as well as for agriculture and for navigation. To this, Socrates said, it amuses me to see how afraid you are, lest the common herd of people should accuse you of recommending a useless subject. The question of science and responsibility and its responsibility towards the society is at least as old as this conversation. This question has been asked in a variety of social, economic, and cultural contexts, and perhaps there is no conclusion to this debate. What we as academicians can do is to try and ask this question to our own selves. We can try and examine it from new perspectives, different ideologies. We can share new ideas and develop our own. We can engage and learn or even unlearn. And to help us do just that, we have with us our speaker for today, Professor Shiv Visvanathan, who is going to help us look at science through the prism of nationalism. Professor Visvanathan is a face familiar to all since he's an adjunct faculty at RRI. He is an orator and an intellectual, a prolific writer, and a regular columnist for leading newspapers. He is currently serving as a professor at Jindal Global Law School and director, Center for Study for Knowledge Systems, OP Jindal Global University. With a PhD in anthropology from University of Delhi, he is a student of liberal arts from a family of scientists. Without taking any more of your time, I would like to invite Professor Visvanathan to the podium.
I don't know whether my lecture is going to satisfy you. So let me begin with what looks like an obituary. Thank you, Ravi and Lakshmi, for inviting me. Mine is a personal search. I'm interested in the gossip of science. In fact, I began this question by actually, one day when I was sitting in class, two texts were before me. One was a fragment from Oppenheimer's interviews, where he said the atomic bomb is an answer to a technical question. And next to it, I was reading Loren Eiseley, the great evolutionist. And Eiseley has this fantastic story of a scientist who spent his best years at Los Alamos. Later, he leaves it, becomes a grandfather. And then one day when he's walking, he spies the tortoise, picks it up and says, it'll make a wonderful gift for my grandchildren. Walks 2 steps, stops, puts it down again and says, I've interfered enough with nature for a lifetime. I wanted a discourse that would strand these two questions, these two stories. And in a way, I discovered that discourse in my backyard. I think the discourses of nationalism and science in India are brilliant. They've never been archived. In fact, if you look at the question of science and nationalism, the first thing you got to understand is it's a failure of storytelling. In fact, if you look at a book like Sumit Sarkar, the standard book on Swadeshi nationalism, J.C. Bose gets exactly a paragraph. What happened? And then you open up the archives. It's probably one of the greatest archives on science, history of science anywhere in the world. And what's beautiful about it is it's the most confident nationalism you can ever see. In fact, I was looking at the records of the Indian Association of Cultivation of Science, where Raman began his career. The first goal of the organization is to rescue science from Western civilization. That's the kind of confidence we had. And it was also a kind of confidence because I can't think of a nationalism which was more hospitable to other people. The availability of eccentricity becomes stunning in the national movement. Nationalism did not wear a uniform. It was an invitation to some of the most plural ideas possible. In fact, that's why I'm going to talk about the other colonialisms. The number of Englishmen, eccentric Englishmen, who formed part of the Indian national movement. If you look at an NCERT textbook, they'll talk of Alan Octavian Hume as the father of the Indian Congress. But few realize he was the greatest ornithologist of the 19th century. He begins Stray Feathers, which Salim Ali then takes over and edits. Patrick Geddes, probably one of the greatest the man who began sociology in India, wrote 29 major town plans and did a theory of the university, which is still one of the greatest. Why is it these people are forgotten? Can we now put an archive back, especially at the moment when nationalism has become a nation state? When the new heroes of your time look like provincial creatures next to the archives of the 20s and 30s. I just want to tell a few stories within the time I have. There are going to be gaps. I could cover them in the later lectures. In fact, I want to begin with Gandhi, because in a way it sets the tone. The tone for nationalism, because Gandhi was not a Luddite. I think that's one of the first things we have to understand. There was a confidence to Gandhi which was remarkable. I remember a Western journalist once asking him, what do you think of Western civilization? And he says it would be a good idea. But the humor of Gandhi is what captures his ideas of science and technology. I remember Jamanlal Bajaj had once given him a Ford car. Like other things in the ashram, it ran for exactly 2 weeks and broke down. Gandhi had it tethered by 2 cows. And whenever visitors came, he would say, look at my Oxford. There was that sense of laughter, the sense of celebration that this was an encounter of 2 civilizations and nationalism was going to mediate it. In fact, the goal of the national movement was not to overthrow the British, but to rescue them from their modernity. I think once you understand the civilizational purpose, I think we're talking a different language. You have to forget the Narendra Modis and the rest of the world. Their illiteracy, their provinciality makes no sense to the national movement, because most of the nationalists were actually anti-national. Tagore, Gandhi, all of them would be arrested today for secessionist statements. And I think this is really what we have to begin by understanding. The nationalism we're talking about was a kind of cosmopolitanism. But yet, there is this encounter. And the first question people ask is, how do you become a scientist? And to me, the most poignant example of the role of a scientist, I can think of 3. Vishveshwaraya, P.C. Ray, Jagdish Bose. And the interesting thing about all these people is they had no theory of method. Autobiography was the experiment. So if you read P.C. Ray's 600 pages, The Life and Experiences of a Chemist, there's nothing personal about the book. The book is about separating the private from the public. Apart from knowing that Ray had constipation, you'd not discover a single personal line in the book. But Ray's life was an autobiographical study of method. You look at Vishveshwaraya's work, it's the same. Here was a man who thought character building, dam building, and nation building were isomorphic activities. And he's probably the only one who numbered his biography as if it was a policy document. Strange, fascinating creatures. But to me, the poignancy of developing science came from J.C. Bose. 6 volumes of the Bose letters show you what it means for an Indian to be a scientist at a time when Indians were not considered fit for science. And the most brilliant of these exchanges go between Bose and Tagore. Bose was the older man, and his first trip to Europe had made him a sensation. And I remember the young Tagore goes to meet him, doesn't find him in the laboratory, leaves behind a set of magnolia blossoms. The exchange begins. And the poignancy between the two is stunning as Bose talks to Tagore about what it means for an Indian scientist to live on a half salary. They were never paid in full. And then Tagore reads Bose's letter, which shows that actually the commissioner, high commissioner, lieutenant commissioner writes back by saying, you Indians can live on a half salary. It's fit for a native gentleman. The roots, the arrogance of colonialism is there, but it's something deeper. And in fact, Bose puts it brilliantly. He said the trouble with being a scientist is you'd feel like a parrot, which is not only taken away from home but has to speak in English. The pressure of being a scientist is fascinating. And you can see it in Bose's work. I think only when you start looking at both the conversations between Bose, Tagore, Kumaraswamy, you start understanding the way people thought about science. And to me, the most fascinating of these encounters, I want to begin with again, I'm going to hop, step, and jump a bit just to cover the foreground, is Gandhi. And the scene where I think the beginnings of modern science begin is Champaran. This is the 100th anniversary of Champaran. But if you read the history of science, you read the history of nationalism on Champaran, take the best of Indian historians, Kapila Vatsyayan, David Hardiman, and you read the documents, you realize none of them knew a word of science. In fact, what is created in that movement is actually quite fascinating. You read the records of Champaran, which is about the disappearance of indigo. And what strikes you is, what a colorless document. In fact, one of the later historians says something interesting. He says the one blind spot of the Indian national movement was color. In fact, if you look at it, the opposition between khaki and khadi is stunning. And the same historian says, khaki is not a color. It's the availability of drabness in many forms. And sometimes I think khadi is quite an imitation of it, in its asceticism, in its lack of celebration of the festival of color. And I think we have to understand it because the greatest critique of khadi came from Tagore. Because that Gandhi gave you a critique of the machine, but the solution he gave you was one of mechanical drabness. He said the sadness of khadi is it's not erotic enough. Khadi, which was supposed to be a solution and a celebration of life, is actually the order of a beehive. A beehive is beautiful, it's natural, but it lacks the dreams and desires of culture. It's a different Tagore. And remember, this Tagore is different because he is a man who actually worked on science. He produced a textbook on science. J.C. Bose, Tagore, and in fact, held summer schools in science in 1917 in Darjeeling. Records have disappeared. But I think what you got to understand is the conversation that took place between these people was fascinating. Let's just take one encounter between the man who headed the first Indian School of Chemistry, P.C. Ray, and Ananda Kumaraswamy. Ray, in his review of international chemistry, synthetic chemistry, says, synthetic chemistry is the tapas of the future, and it will drive all Indian products obsolescent. Ananda Kumaraswamy, a brilliant art critic, but also remember, a great geologist, head of the Geological Survey of Sri Lanka at that time, of Ceylon at that time, says he cannot understand how a scientist like Ray could approach synthetic chemistry with such fear and trembling. And the debate that ensues is fascinating. Because what Kumaraswamy argues for is diversity. In fact, he almost seems to imply that red in English is an inadequate word for the universe of red. Red doesn't capture the redness of red. In fact, I heard another comment similar to it much later during my childhood, when K.S. Krishnan was trying to explain to my sister that Shehep isn't red. The redness of red needs words beyond English. And that's what he said. One of the first things that we are trustees to is diversity. Kumaraswamy, in fact, begins the first of the great critics of science. And he asks, it's a traditionalist critique of a man who believed tradition had a certain sanctity, a certain role of trusteeship. And he says, if God were to return, and his critique centered around the museum. He said the Indian national movement must fight a guerrilla war against the museum. I remember I was stunned to read it the first time. And then he said the museum smells like signs of death in formaldehyde. He says, if God were to return today and ask civilized Western man where the Aztecs and Incas were, or even the Australian apologies are, would he take him to the museum? Because what Kumaraswamy wanted was, the museum represented a kind of humanitarianism which objectified dead and dying cultures. What he wanted to do was to create a tradition where tradition existed multiple times. And the variety of knowledges that could exist became dialogic. Tagore, Bose, Kumaraswamy, Gandhi start the dialogue of the sciences. And I think one has to understand that this dialogue went further than professional science. There's a beauty to these debates. And it's in this context that I want to just take one issue. The letters between Patrick Geddes and Rabindranath Tagore. In fact, eventually, one of the first conceptualization documents of the Indian Institute of Science is written by Patrick Geddes. It's nowhere in the archives. I managed to compile it from all the letters in Pioneer. Geddes says something interesting. He said the trouble with the Indian national movement was it was invented before the national movement understood thermodynamics. I think it's one of the most fascinating critiques of Indian nationalism. He says the Indian national movement was mediocre because it read the wrong West. The West before the development of biology, ecology, of a biologistic view of the world. And he says that's why we created not a post-Germanic university, but a pre-Germanic university based on the examination systems of the London University of the time. He said national movement, for all its attempt to overthrow the Englishman, is an act of imitation, is an act of mediocrity. He said, why do you want to convert princes into public school boys, pundits into clerks, and workers into Philistines, when you can create a different vision of civilization? And I think we have to understand this critique because it was a critique that the Indian national movement, for all its rhetoric, had great elements of mediocrity. Something unpalatable, but true. And then he begins a critique of the university, which is brilliant. He says, every university that began in the West was always a relation to context. It was a relation to the dissenting academies of the time. The medieval university responded to Aristotle. The Renaissance university developed by looking at the work of Pythagoras and the other free-floating Greeks. And he said the modern German university is actually a French invention. It plays out the encyclopedia, when an architectonic of the encyclopedia becomes the architecture of the university. And he said to that we added a Chinese invention, the examination system, which Napoleon did. And he says, what you have to understand in a deep and fundamental way is, if we had to establish a modern university, we should have had a debate with the knowledge systems of our time, with the traditional systems of medicine, biology, craft. He said the Indian national movement avoided this. And this leads to a fascinating document that no one talks about. Tagore planned Shantiniketan with Patrick Geddes. But the Shantiniketan that emerges is only the aesthetic part. Patrick Geddes stayed behind and left enough documents to show that actually what Shantiniketan was to be was a critique of post-Germanic science. A critique of science beyond mechanistic physics. A critique of science which went beyond an overt collaboration with the state. He said, if you can create such a futuristic university, then nationalism has hope. In fact, he says, I don't think we understand the relation between town and city. It's the relation of how to understand waste, which needs an understanding of thermodynamics. In fact, if you watch these debates, they're fascinating. And I think one thing that we're missing here again and again is that the presence of these eccentric Englishmen gave Indian nationalism or cosmopolitanism. You read the letters of Bose and Tagore, nationalism disappears. In fact, Tagore says a violent nationalism is the first sign of dullness, tiredness, and mediocrity. Something which we can all vouch for today. And he says, how do you create a cosmopolitanism? And they examine Bose's tactics to be a recognized scientist. He says it's danger to be an Orientalist, because then you're seen like a kind of magician. It's danger to get caught in Western eccentricity, because then you're only seen as a psychic research person. How do you challenge the paradigms of science? How do you get acceptance? There's a dailiness, there's an everydayness to these tactics which are brilliant. And I think the 6 volumes of these letters are worth reading. Tagore had his own idea of the university. He said, the real debate is a dialogue of civilizations. A dialogue between what he called he said, the university in the West is a microcosm of the city. The university in India is a microcosm of the forest. The city dominated nature. The forest lived in harmony with it. So he said the dialogue of civilizations would be a dialogue between the Forest University of India and the city universities of the West. 2 architectural structures which need to debate it out. There's not something about asserting the superiority of one or the other. Dialogue between equals, where the result is open. Whether you look at Bose or Tagore, there was no sense of inferiority complex. But there was a powerful critique of the West and the possibility of inventing and looking at the other West. And I think one of the most fascinating ways by which the other West of ecology, feminism, enters in India is theosophy. I remember when I began theosophy, I thought it was one of those namby-pamby occult things that you discover. And then the first theosophist scientist I met was Alfred Wallace. Wallace was a genius. And I remember reading his wonderful Century, which anticipates Thomas Kuhn by 100 years. First 200 pages are a celebration of Victorian science. And then he stops and says, a science in its moment of hegemony might lose its innovativeness by becoming dominant, by becoming coercive, by not being open to dissenting ideas. And he says, the genius of science demands that dissenting imaginations come from the leading scientists themselves. Powerful idea. Something we could follow today. And then for the second half of the book is about all the dissenting imaginations in science, of how psychic research is not a site just for table tapping and the occult, but the possibilities of breaking the mind-body dichotomy in new ways. Of to creating a science which goes beyond the official positivisms to create an open-ended world. Here again, the theme is diversity. And the brilliance of the document is stunning, because what the theosophists do is they say the only way to challenge the hegemony of science is to multiply bodies. The psychic body, the occult body. And what does it lead to? I think it does 2 things. It provides a critique of the violence of science, a critique of vivisection. In fact, if you look at the feminist movement at the time, it was a critique of vivisection. I was just looking at the records of the 1907 Anti-Vivisection Congress. Hordes of feminists brilliantly arguing the case against Louis Pasteur and others on why experimentation on the body does not lead to full scientific results. And 2, the ethical dangers of trying to see that if you begin with animals, one day you'll use these same experiments on human beings without ethical controls. I wish the Indian Academy of Sciences had read these documents before it produced its own ethics document, which is pre-1907. It's worth looking at. What happened to this tradition of debate? But I think the most fascinating critique out of all this comes is from a great theosophist, Srinivas Murthy, Madras doctor, trained at Madras Medical College, fights the Afghan war, spends most of the Afghan war protecting his kurmi from British attack, comes back and decides to be a theosophist. And he becomes the secretary of the Osman Committee, where he argues why you need a pluralistic system of medicine. Srinivas Murthy was a fascinating guy. 2 years before Frederick Soddy, he predicts the dangers of nuclear energy. I got a shock when I read the document. He was John Barrymore's doctor when the actor was an alcoholic. Became a lawyer. But I think what he tries to show is actually we need competing epistemologies. Democracy without a pluralism of epistemologies is not democratic, because when you can't talk about equivalence and equality of knowledges, you don't have a link between knowledge and democracy. 1919. None of the sentimentality about tradition. He says democracy is a debate of epistemologies. They are buried, another documents we are buried. And he says, look, don't look at agriculture only as a missing, dying way of life. Agriculture gives you a way of thinking about epistemologies. Because it helps you link food and medicine into a new theory of civilization. Because when you look at the science laboratory, it misses the context. But with agriculture, context can be brought back in a way where lifestyle and life systems can interact in a different way. He says agriculture is epistemology. It's not just an economic system. And that's something that keeps coming back. We tend to look at agriculture as a passé, as a system which is moving on. But when you look at Albert Herbert and Srinivas Murthy, they say agriculture is ecology, ecology is epistemology. Howard argues for epistemology from a theory of soils. Srinivas Murthy argues for a new theory of medicine from a theory of agriculture. What I'm trying to say is Indian nationalism was theoretical and confidently theoretical to its core. Today when you talk about, you just have to compare the current enthusiasm for Ayurveda with Srinivas Murthy's documents. The illiteracy of one confronts a very persuasive philosophical argument, which we have lost. In fact, we confront a situation where nationalism is cosmopolitanism and literate, but the nation state is parochial and wears a uniform. I'll just discuss two more and then come back to it in a different way. Take the theosophist idea of childhood. People forget Maria Montessori was in India as an Italian intern. And as a part of the theosophist movement, she begins the theosophist schools, but with a critique of science. The critique of science at that time was a great preoccupation with the wolf boy. What happens to a child which is abandoned to nature? The work of Walter Itard and others. And Besant and Montessori realized you need an answer to the wolf boy. And they produce one which is simultaneously a critique of Baden-Powell's racist idea of the Boy Scout. The Boy Scout movement that you think of today universally is an Indian patent, is an Indian invention. Because they thought the Boy Scout is a child that could live in harmony with nature. So then you see the oppositions playing out about childhood at that time. Wolf boy, Boy Scout. Monster, idiot. Angel, monster, the child as angel. Which is, by the way, the first theoretical argument for Jiddu Krishnamurti. The occult child. Remember, he's theoretically posited before being empirically discovered. The dreams of childhood, I think, were one of the most fascinating parts of this dream. And I think this imagination of childhood is something we need to sustain today. A critique of violence, a theory of diversity, the imagination of childhood makes nationalism much more wide-ranging than we have thought. It's a pity that we have sort of banked out, even the theosophists deny the value of these documents. You go to the Theosophist library, they have brilliant 14th century documents on occult sciences, but they won't give it to you. They say, today we are Jungian. There's an embarrassment about their own past, which I think we have to learn to reconstruct. Let me push it just a bit further. And take a man who innovates, constructs the world, and in fact disrupts it. Meghnad Saha and the Science and Culture group. I don't think there was a Marxist idea in science, but there was a Leninist one. And I think it belonged to the Science and Culture group. At one level, the Science and Culture group, pre-Bernalian in its intentions, anticipates the Bernals of the time. And I think it begins with a man called Meghnad Saha, astrophysicist, ionospheric expert. But I think what was really important about it is Saha was deeply anti-colonial. In fact, he couldn't enter the civil service exams because of his association with the terrorist, in brackets, Bagajatin. And it's in that time that Saha tries to understand. I mean, it's a fast career. By 26, he's established the University of Allahabad, which later goes to Delhi to create a great department of physics. And it's at that time he suddenly discovers that he's irritated with the Congress, particularly with a congressman called Kailashnath Kadju. Kadju gives a brilliant speech, or so he thought, about how a match factory would be the beginning of industrialization in India. And Saha, who was acerbic and badly behaved at his best, normal time, was utterly acerbic. He said the Congress doesn't understand industrialization. And he goes out and he creates a new theory of industrialization, which he borrows from the Soviet Academy of Sciences. He borrows it from the work of Gleb Michael Krasnozovsky. Krasnozovsky had the idea of energetica, of how the energy index of a civilization is what gives it its priorities. And Saha goes out, takes out the League of Nations documents, and finds that America has an index of 2,500, Britain 2,000, and India a quite modest 85. And he says, what do we do to do that? And that's when he reads Lenin's great dictum, Soviets plus electrification equal to communism. Of course, he modifies it. But I think what he does is he establishes planning in India as a dream of a society based on the scientific method. He goes to meet Subhash Bose. Now I think here you've got to understand, 3 classes at the Presidency College between 1909 and 1912 virtually create this dream. In fact, if you look at all the major scientists of that time, they are from these 3 classes. There's a certain nepotism to it, but a brilliant one. You find that actually Subhash Bose was Saha's junior by 2 years, but Bose's 2 elder brothers were Saha's classmates. So when Bose becomes president of the Indian Congress, Saha goes to him and says, what are you going to do? Bose says, what do you want? He says, give me the National Planning Committee. Typically, Saha goes 1 day late for the meeting. Vishveshwaraya is already elected president of the Planning Committee. But Saha goes to the great engineer and says, you can't be head of the Planning Committee. Vishveshwaraya says, why? He says, we need a new collaboration between politics and science. Vishveshwaraya and Saha then decide that the best candidate would be the young Jawaharlal Nehru. That's how Nehru enters the Planning Commission. You have to understand, planning was not the creation of economists any more than the Green Revolution was. Most of these were created by scientists. A lot of the dreams of economics today are the dreams of science. You take the members who dreamt planning, Mahalanobis, and if you look at any of these names, they had a very scientific attitude to the creation of science in India. Saha dreamt of a society based on the scientific method. And I haven't read the full records, but I remember when he was in the Calendrical Reform Committee, the Jews approached him. And Saha said, you can't have Sabbath, because Sabbath is unscientific. You've got to understand that to a certain extent, what is being created are 2 versions of the scientific temper. The positivist one and the more open-ended one. And nationalism, in a way, plays out a dialectic between the 2. I think this is really what I want to open up with. That our nationalism was actually anti-national. That it dreamt of a science which was more than just sheer positivism. It wanted a set of balancing acts where we could create the dream of a democracy and a science, coexisting and debating simultaneously together a theory of diversity. It was hospitable. No one was barred because he was English. In fact, English became just one other way of being Indian. I think that gives you a different kind of confidence, a different kind of openness to the ideas of imperialism. Because as Gandhi and Tagore said, Imperialism is only one facet of the West, and a nationalism which only debates imperialism but doesn't understand the wider culture of the West is bound to be boring and violent, something we have achieved today. And I think the real challenge to us today is how do we recover this imagination? The dreams of childhood, the critique of violence, the possibility of diversity, the idea that science can be done in the vernacular. How do you persuade the dreams of nationalism to be somehow involved in the parochialism of the nation state? I think one thing we have to understand, deeply, desperately, this was a more imaginative period. You can assemble your top scientists today. Between them, they can't produce 5 paragraphs on science, which matches in quality the debate that went on at that time. And I think that's the real challenge today. To me, it's also a personal challenge to the current BJP regime, which has no idea of nationalism and no idea of science. One up on anything we know. How do we use scholarship and our theories of an epistemic science to bring back a democracy which can be dialogic, plural, and bring knowledge to the forefront of any democratic imagination? I'll stop here. We'll take the rest in discussions.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Now the floor is open for questions.
Back? Yeah.
What's the cause of this disconnect after the 30s or 40s to the present time?
I think we had a civilizational attitude earlier.
We didn't get the question right to get the conversation on.
I said, what is the cause of this, what caused this disconnect, this decline from 30s, 40s to the present time, when this vision has disappeared?
I think several things. One, I don't think we have a theory of diversity today. And I think that's very clear within the sciences. But I think more fundamentally, I think the way we normalized science in the 50s was the second problem. To me, central to the post-partition imagination is the Bengal famine. We never did a critique of the Bengal famine. 3.5 million people die, and we normalized it into a theory of planning. That fascinates me. You use statistics, you use things, but no one questions the fact that the Bengal famine actually took more victims than partition. We turned it into a theory of planning and science. So for the first time, we start bureaucratizing science. Two, I think it's the sheer decline in eccentricity. Yeah. And I could give a few more, but I think our current notions, science speaks the worst social science I know. Its current use of economics, nation state, democracy is third rate. At a time when social science is abandoning these concepts, the Victorian mindset of each of these concepts is being held by official scientists.
I mean, I might not say this very clearly, but one question that seems to be one statement that is overarching in all of this is that somehow science has declined since the 30s. I don't quite understand that statement. The other is that, and you mentioned it briefly, but the role of economics in all of this analysis is very, very crucial, in my opinion. The transition, what you call the mediocrity, which became, the transition being mediocre. In a condition precisely because of an economic situation which could bring on the Bengal famine, where coffers were completely empty. You went from a completely impoverished state into a state of some means, that transition to not place this growth of science or lack of growth of science, or the fact that maybe science didn't grow enough, perhaps that's a critique, but to place it outside of a very fundamental, overarching economic framework, and in particular in the modern context, with the big capital C word. You've not mentioned any of that. To me, that seems vital, and in the spirit of Bernal, in fact, vital way in which we must see science today.
Let me first disagree with your history of Bengal famine, second with your understanding of Bernal, and three with the question of economics. No, I think let's take it head on. One, all these economic categories in India were devised by physicists and statisticians. There was hardly any economist present. Two, I think the kind of critique that Geddes wanted, that economics should rework itself after the discovery of thermodynamics, was not applied. Scientists were the most reluctant to provide a critique of economics when they could have done it. It took till the 60s for Georgescu-Roegen and others to appear for an ecological critique of economics. Now, look, most of the major decisions in economics were made by scientists. The economists came much later, they were secondary. Their pomposity hides their absence of history. So that's one. Two, the Bengal famine was an artificial creation. It was an act of genocide, it was an act of triage. There's no economic reason for it. They wanted to starve a people to stop the Japanese. That's a strategic decision. To reduce it to some kind of rationalist act of economics is unbelievable. Even Churchill couldn't have tried it. No, wait, let me push it. So the question I'm trying to push is, when you talk, you're talking today about the dominance of economic categories today. But the critique of economics first came from within science, from within the acts of ecology and thermodynamics. The thing is, we didn't continue it. Third thing, I didn't say science has declined. I said the vision of science in a civilizational sense has moved from nationalism to the nation state. And that is the narrowing of the imagination. Fourth, which Bernal are you talking about, father or son? They wrote two different contradictory books. Social Function of Science, to which I think you're it, also has no sense of Bernal's understanding of literature. Wait, no, I think you have to be careful. We take this one book and narrow Bernal down. Bernal was a visionary. In fact, he was as great an authority on James Joyce about literature, language, and the possibilities. And remember, eventually Martin Bernal follows Needham to provide the civilizational complement to his father's work. So I think if you look at that group as a set, I think you get a different picture from the standard picture with Indian stake, where they isolate Social Function of Science and make it the ideological book of the so-called radical critic somewhere. It doesn't work. Sorry. You know, I'll give you a personal example. People said Bernal never talked about nature. I remember my father telling me a story about how Bernal and he were traveling on Dalma Lake. And my father accidentally dropped the thing that the Tatars were thinking of chemically coating the lake. Bernal grabbed my father's hand and said, "Young man, never fool around with nature. It'll outthink you." This guy was a wider visionary. I think Bernal needs a second treatment. Social Function of Science is a brilliant book, but I think it has to be located within the other books and also within the Needhamian debate. Otherwise, what you get, unfortunately for Bernal, is an economist critique, which is not fair to Bernal.
You'd given a talk at IAC a few months ago at the launch of a new journal called. You'd given a talk at IAC a few months ago at the launch of a new journal called Dialogue, where I think you memorably said that scientists need a crash course on democracy.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you meant that the priorities of science no longer overlap with the priorities of democracy, and if so, when do you think that shift happened? Has it ever been the case that the priorities overlap?
Okay, let's put it bluntly. It was a debate with Rodham and Balram, where they gave a certain kind of professionalized view of science, and a positivist view almost. What I'm trying to say is there's a wider scientific imagination. And it's been present in a series of people I can think of. Whether it's Shivraj Ramaseshan, it's Satish Dhawan, all of them articulated a wider view of science and democracy. The question is, who's your choice? I hate to say many of the scientists today are quite narrow. But that doesn't mean they're not scientists of the other type. They need a different kind of visibility. Let me cite an example. You have to talk to the person in front of you. Her mother was a scientist who actually had a better understanding of pottery, music, and civilization than most people. Am I right? I think it's worth looking at the collaboration between Purnima and Surajit Sinha on what anthropology and physics could do to create an alternative imagination. It's a pity not much has been written about her. But if you go to CGCRI in Calcutta, there's a kind of folklore history of Purnima Sinha. I think it's worth listening to and talking about. And I can think of many scientists like that. Question is, who are your role models? The current dispensation? Or can you think of counterexamples? It's tempting.
Yeah, this is regarding this comment you made that, okay, nowadays, if you look at, most scientists are quite narrow because they just do whatever they do. Is it not similar in other fields? For example, if you, in 20s or 30s, if you have some disease, you just go to a GP and GP tells, I mean, there's no specialist, right? So you just go to the GP and, so as the knowledge improves or more and more things, so it's impossible for one person to master all the diverse topics. So that's why we have now cardiologists, we have neurosurgeons, this thing. So similar is also true in science, right? I mean, so in the 20s and 30s, so it was possible for people to be diverse and look at a broader range of science. But today's world, I think it's not possible to be that broad because I think within the last 100 years, science has developed a lot, right? So is it necessarily a bad thing to be specialist in a particular area? Or, I mean, I just want to...
The question is at two levels.
Yeah.
Is there an innocence to specialization? Up to a point. But that doesn't mean you don't have a holistic view of your subject. And wait, it's not, no, it's not less. Your argument that it doesn't exist today is not true. I think some of the most interesting studies about philosophy of science.
Philosophy of science is very different from scientists doing science.
Wait a minute, I'm talking about people like Ilya Prigozhin, his collaborators. If you look at the work, they're now talking about a return to the enchantment of nature. You're talking today of great physicists who are now talking a different world. So the idea that it was specialization provides you with a kind of refuge, a sanctity, is not available to you because this is the era in which the pugwash movement was created. This is the era where people like Linus Pauling created the possibility.
So that was a time.
No, it continues.
So
today.
that was in, let's say, 30s.
No,
right?
I'm talking about the Vietnam War period in the 60s.
Yeah, 50s, 60s.
No,
right? That was the time when quantum mechanics was developed. That was the time when statistical physics were developed, and there was an interlink between different subjects.
Today, there are breakthroughs in science which are in fact aiding democracy. The notion of the risk sciences, the idea of how complexity is entering into other domains. So where is the narrowing? You want to hide behind a specialization? You're right to...
No.
Wait, let me finish. As a professional. But it's a refuge, a shelter, a solace. But it doesn't hide the growing problems of science and society.
See, you can be very broad and keep talking about science to other people, or you can actually be whatever narrow, quote unquote narrow, and contribute to the science, right? These are two different things.
You can do both.
And you can do both. You can do both, but there are only very few people actually who are capable of doing both.
That few were critical. And I think it made a big difference. Just allow the possibility that some of your top scientific leaders also took stands on democracy. Is that unbelievable?
But what made you think that they don't take stand on democracy,
Name
for
one.
example?
Today.
I mean, what kind of
No, publicly, public.
We have
Yeah,
been
name one.
we have been signing
What?
signing letters on. Yeah,
Beyond signing letters, take a public stand for heaven's sake.
but then why do
No, wait.
no
okay.
no I, no,
no,
I, I,
give me the counter. Give me the equivalent of the pugwash movement today.
equivalent of.
The pugwash movement today. I'm not indicting you.
No, no,
I'm saying the
no, no.
possibility of a creative theory of knowledge combining with a new idea of ethics
Yeah.
and politics is much more available today.
But that's
And there are people who can do it.
yeah, but that's true with any profession. I mean, like, why should doctors be
No.
not allowed to
No,
take
no,
part
wait,
in this?
wait,
Why
wait,
should
wait.
engineers be not allowed to take
you're
part
wrong. The amount of debates now taking place in medicine around iatrogeny, around medical ethics, are stunning.
But
No, just look at your equivalent documents. Look at your ethics documents.
but
Can you improve them? Very simple question. I'd be content.
maybe we can.
Professor God?
Science is also probably culture in which in that time of great engineering inventions in England, there was very little contribution from scientists.
I agree.
It was largely made by handymen
Yeah.
because there was a certain kind of culture which dominated
Sure.
the view of science. I completely agree with you that the specialized work that a scientist does, if it is rooted against a background, I'm sure that good, right-thinking scientists have a whole worldview against which they work, whether it is putting their next foot forward or doing science, whatever it is. And if one does it without that, then I question that kind of science which is being done. But what I wish to ask is that what happened to the cultural milieu in which the post-independent science grew? Because the way India was going forward as compared to the rest of the world before independence had a creativity which seemed to have completely been lost after independent science. What happened to that culture? What happened to Indian culture and what is it happening today? And how does one get out of it?
See, let's take just the example of Marxism. Marxism also gave you a broad-based cosmopolitan theory of culture. So that the idiocy of every class analysis, you had IPTA. Your dreams of linking theatre to a wider field, your dreams about linking questions of inequality and justice to the ideas of science and technology. This is not an anti-science view. I'm saying the possibilities that we have to look at. That science in a way has to come back. One is the university. I think the university in a way broke up our idea of culture. I mean, what is the university? It's a breakdown of knowledge systems. You need an integrated theory of knowledge, a holism, where that conversation between different kinds of disciplinarity, different kinds of cultures takes place. You look at the older generation of scientists, they had skills of different sorts. Mahalanobis was an authority on Tagore. You had a wider notion of culture, which they took for granted. I think many of them came from a civilizational idea of culture, to which science was a response. So it was science and civilization, not science and the nation state. I think that made a great difference to the way they talked and wrote about the subject. They talked about ethics, aesthetics, poetics, not science policy. That narrowing is a bit worrying. And I think it's important that scientists respond to it, which doesn't indict them. It's an invitation to a different kind of debate.
Is there any way that one could create amongst the larger.
Yeah, one is recover the history. Look at the debates of Raman. Even the quarrelsome debates of Raman and Zaha have something to teach you. Cantankerous as it is. Look at this wider civilizational debate.
Absolutely.
Recover the archives.
Absolutely.
Why is it that even history of science is not even taught as a proper subject?
Gems, flowers, music, whatever you
Look,
talk.
You look at J.C. Bose. He is the first guy to get actually Tagore translated into Russian, so Peter Kropotkin could read it. Kabuliwala. So what I'm trying to say is that dialogue between cultures where literature, science, religion were being debated in a different stage has to be brought in again. No, I think today it's coming. Today the necessities of creating a democratic imagination, whether you look at the South African Truth Commission, where you look at the Latin American movements of the Indigenista, this is coming back. I'm just hoping India can join it. And the Vietnam War period is not very far away. After all, if I'm not mistaken, J.N. Ramchandran was Linus Pauling's student. You can think of continuities. And that debate becomes interesting. A Christian could talk about Pavlova. So what I'm trying to say is there's an invitation to a different set of possibilities. I'm not questioning your professionalism. I'm questioning giving you the possibility of experimenting with a new notion of responsibility. And it has exciting prospects. One, you might do something to counter the anti-democratic movements today. Well, what is being broken by the RSS? Your syllabus, your constitution, your culture. 3 rampant forms of illiteracy.
One more question.
Sure.
About the bureaucratization of science.
Yeah.
I mean, today, a professor who has done very well in science, normally, statistically, still hankers to be the secretary to the government. And
True.
once he arrives there, he will make sure that he can last as long as he wishes, no extensions, and so forth. And you know how extensions are gained in government. Not by asserting your independence, but something else.
Yeah.
How has that happened? And do you see any signs of that being reversed when academics really value academics much more than anything else?
Oh, actually, it can begin if the academies take over. One of the things that always worries me about India is the silence of the academies. They can, in a way, create structures where eminent scientists are given scope for a different kind of research. Unfortunately, this bureaucratic imagination which says you drop dead at 60 or you need extensions, why not create the possibilities of a different kind of intellectualization, not bureaucratization? The suggestions have been made by many scientists.
I think the academies are beyond repair.
No.
And there are several examples.
No, I can be even more drastic. But let's take a simple experiment at the Academy of Sciences, where a lot of people are now trying to create a dialogue. Let's take it seriously, what Ram Ramaswamy is doing. Let's build around it. It's easy to say beyond repair, and sometimes I agree with you in my more cynical moments. But today, I think the repair for this wider sense of science has to come from within science. And I think there are possibilities.
We have to infect the young.
Yeah, but I think a lot of the young would be ready.
I mean, you saw that report on GM food which the academies
Yeah.
produced.
Yeah, I
3
know.
presidents signed it.
Yeah, I don't want to take that as an example to beat science with. But you could have reversed that report.
Don't take that as an example, but
Yeah.
cite me one example where any of the academies have produced any kind of a document on policy like the like the National
I'll
Academy
take-
of
yeah.
Sciences in
No, I'll
US.
take one debate. The debate between Kasturi Rangan and the ecologists on the Western Ghats. I think it has tremendous possibilities. It could have been continued as a debate. The Gadgil Kasturi Rangan debate, I think it's brilliant. I think there are possibilities there. I would side with Gadgil, but I think there are a lot of people who think Kasturi Rangan has an economic argument in that. Let's push it. But people ignore the debate.
Wait, don't point to me and say economic argument.
No. I think it's an important point. No.
I would also side with Gandhi.
Yeah.
Precisely because I think it is an economic argument.
Yeah, but it's a different kind of economics that he talks about. And I think that changes in the debate on economics is what Gadgil and others were pushing for, which we should push for.
Bring economics back to its root, which comes from ecology.
Yeah.
But then this is exactly about the words, the capitalist word, right? I mean, the word, it is about how we view economics. What is the meaning of any kind of economics?
I don't think it's restricted to capitalism.
Okay, so
Communism did an equally bad job.
we can decide on
No, I think somewhere we have to now go beyond right and left categories to a wider imagination. Maybe Institute of Science or Raman could try the experiment. It has precedence. Satish Dhawan. I remember he brought me into this field after PhD, saying, come and debate with a man called Amulya Reddy. But I think there are possibilities. There are traditions, there are genealogies. Why don't we talk about it?
So, you talked about doing sciences in the vernaculars and also philosophy of sciences. And we had scientists who thought in the vernaculars, like Satyendranath Bose. I don't know why you didn't mention him. Anyway, you have also written about a new public policy for a new India, where you discuss we miss 4 revolutions and all that. And I'm still trying to understand in what language do we think of science, and why philosophy is not taught as a serious subject in schools and colleges and universities. And I don't know.
But we have been recommending that for years.
Yeah.
UGC is stone deaf. Okay? I have written about Satyendranath Bose. In fact, the latest one is a social research. You can take a look at it.
Yeah.
So one has done it. I don't want to keep repeating some of these things. Bose had a tremendous sense of the vernacular. But in a way, it tended to fade out. And I think that same debate then came into the fact that many of the scientists went and tried to create popular movements in schools. Anil Sadgopal, Hoshangabad, tremendous work, because they also were the first resistance in Bhopal. I think there are possibilities we have to build on. We created these mega structures like UGC, which I think subdued thought. And I think it's time to de-bureaucratize these structures in a different way. And that can only be done by having the dissenting imaginations.
Lack of diversity.
Yeah.
So I have a 1.5 question, kind of like. The first question is, I think initial part of the, just tell me if I am wrong. You mentioned that this Western science versus nationalist science.
No versus.
No, so Western science, doing science Western way versus something. I think you said
No,
something.
I think the national movement wanted to know what kind of a science do we construct.
Okay, so now the question is, okay, science is of course very broad,
Sure.
and depending on the subject, it sometimes can be very context dependent. Like for example, if you look at the agriculture, of course you have to look at the Indian agriculture. It doesn't make sense to look at the agriculture of US and do this. But there is also basic science, which is universal. And only way we know of doing basic science successfully is the Western way of doing. And if you, all these people who you have mentioned, their way of doing science was also this Western science. The second point is, you have been mentioning this word thermodynamics, right? Do you actually mean what thermodynamics as physics thermodynamics, or you just took the word and just put it in somewhere?
I think,
So what did you actually precisely mean?
no, I think here what they were talking about is,
No, like for example, when you say something in science, you have to be very precise. And what is your precise thing in the
not necessarily. That's one
No,
definition.
you have to be very
wait.
precise if you do
I
exact
think
science.
in a way, you create a good boy index of science, even which I'd like to challenge. What I'm talking about is, Patrick Geddes was clear that the Indian national movement had an understanding of mechanistic physics, but not the new biology and ecology that was emerging. Because critical to it and the energy systems he was talking about is, economics had no theory of waste. Modern economics had no theory of waste till the 40s.
But what was the mention of thermodynamics in that
Thermodynamics
context?
gives you a notion of waste.
No, that's a very broad way of saying that without understanding thermodynamics, right? I mean, it's
Okay.
not. No, I'm saying
No,
that
no,
then
teach me
no,
thermodynamics without the theory of waste.
What I'm saying is that then you have just picked up the word because
I haven't picked up the word. I'm looking at the records.
No.
I'm looking at the work that Geddes did on energy systems and citing
No,
the reference.
then there's a danger because somebody can pick up the word quantum mechanics and apply to all sorts of things. For example, your consciousness, this, and these people have been doing,
Okay.
right?
No, wait. Let me take
Right.
that challenge.
Yeah,
and
but
push it the other way. Harold Morowitz, the Yale biologist, was once asked, what's the greatest document America produced? He said, the American Constitution. He said, what's the second greatest document? He said, the Gibbs equations for thermodynamics. Now, let me give you a possibility. What if Gibbs was in the Constituent Assembly? Would his notions of physics and chemistry have given you a different notion of rights?
Yeah, it will be.
Yes, that's all I'm asking for.
No, I mean, if you
Yeah.
put scientists in something, okay, it will be better, of course.
No, but I think that's possibilities. We hail one Kosambi, but let's push the damn thing. And let's think of different possibilities. Because it's been too narrow so far. I sympathize. Okay, let me give you a suggestion. No, I get all that. Look, I am not conscripting all of you into the army, but I'm thinking that is there a possibility of a different innovation? And is there a possibility of a different imagination? You feel like being narrow and specialized, no one's going to stop you. But today there are wider crises in ethics, in politics, in democracy, in knowledge systems, in science itself. In terms of accounting and responsibility. Wait, for that, you have to go beyond your specialization.
Right, so if
That's
what
all.
you're saying is be part of the democratic structure around you, society around you, I would completely agree. But not simply as a scientist, as any intellectual, any human being who has certain specialized knowledge, yes, participated in the larger debate.
I disagree.
If that is what
No, I'm not. I'm asking you is to look at your science within the framework of a democratic imagination and stop being so insular. Sorry, gloves are off now. Off. Because of a very simple reason. You guys think you can protect yourself with these little psychological devices which you think are scientific. And don't think it's not available to you anymore. Then don't go around begging for grants from a nation. Because the nation has a right to ask questions. A civilization has a right to ask questions, but it need not be economistic. It can be, as he pointed out, a civilizational debate on the way you look at science. And I think it's important that you consider it. I'm not an evangelist, but some way these wider debates have to be there. Indian science has to produce a response to Bhopal someday.
No, that's Indian economics.
Sorry.
I mean, union
So there was no science.
An industry that was settled there without any checks and
So who went there to settle the problem? The scientists? Why? Between ICM? No. I think some of them did raise very important questions, from Anil Sadgopal to a lot of other people. And I think the question they raised is, can we now look at the epistemologies of science, to the theories of suffering, to look at Bhopal in a different way? I worked with them. Many of them did tremendous work. It's time you look at it. Sorry. I think, no, the gentleman there has been waiting.
Do you have any general message for all of us who are bringing up next generation of students? They can be our children, they can be anywhere else. You think that we are lacking something, the present generation lacks something in producing enough for the society? And if we want to patch up that, what is it that you would like us to do for our children?
Oh, let them be children.
Children will become like us tomorrow.
I'm serious. Because I think one of the things you're watching today within the university system and within the kind of competition taking place is the sheer destruction of childhood. Let the dreams of childhood which the national movement raised come back. I don't have a message, I have a request.
I don't think we have an answer to everything.
I don't.
But we cannot find an answer unless we debate, unless we look at all the possibilities, consider them, analyze them rigorously. We cannot find an answer. And I think that is the key. Can we have an atmosphere where we debate? Do we have opportunities to ask questions which are not according to the current way of thinking? Can we become iconoclasts? I mean, there was a time when nobody would question the mechanism.
Yes. We would like to thank, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we are really running out of time. We would like to thank our speaker for the day, Professor Visvanathan. And yes, yes, I was going to add, continuing with this conversation, we would like to invite all of you to the library terrace and continue the conversation, the debate with Professor Visvanathan.
Thank you.